Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Before I get started, I wanted to take a moment to say a quick thanks to the Center for Mark Twain Studies, the Park Church, and Quarry Farm for having me over on such an auspicious occasion. For anyone watching a recording of this talk at some point in the future, it is right now, July 20th, 2022. And today is an important date in American history because of a couple of significant anniversaries that fall on this day. One being, some 53 years ago tonight, and 238,000 miles from this spot, on July 20th, 1969, crew members of the Apollo 11 mission first set foot on the surface of the moon. That's not all. Slightly more locally, another important anniversary, some 174 years ago tonight, and a more modest 60 miles or so from this spot, on July 20th, 1848, it was the second and final day of the Seneca Falls Convention. The convention itself took place here in the Wesleyan Chapel, the Methodist Church in the village of Seneca Falls, located on the north end of Cayuga Lake. For anyone who may be unfamiliar or is only semi-familiar with the Seneca Falls Convention, it marked the beginning of the American suffrage movement, a 72-year-long campaign demanding civil rights for women, primarily the ability to vote in elections. But a lot of things would have to change to get to that point. In 1848, women were strongly discouraged from speaking aloud in public, a taboo that participants were in willful violation of at the convention. In most states, they were barred from owning property. This is because they were seen in the eyes of the law more often as property, belonging to husbands, belonging to fathers. Divorce was an extreme rarity in 1848, so there were no legally available means of distancing yourself from an abusive spouse. Women could not hold the vast majority of occupations or easily acquire an advanced education, and as a result, faced major impediments in the way of supporting themselves economically. So, at the Seneca Falls Convention, participants broached the radical subject of eliminating those burdens. But only two of the individuals present, or so the legend goes, had the nerve to support the idea that women should secure the right to vote. It was such a fringe, unheard of idea at the time. They were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. As a side note, I try to make it clear to my students that there is a big difference between choosing and inventing. The people at the Seneca Falls Convention weren't choosing a political platform from a set of readily available options. Rather, they were inventing, imagining, dreaming up that platform whole cloth. There is a big difference. In favor of these new ideas in circulation, that women should enjoy some basic civil liberties, 100 individuals, 68 women and 32 men, added their signatures to the Declaration of Sentiments, a document closely modeled after the Declaration of Independence, where the tyranny of King George has been substituted with the tyranny of man. We do not have an original surviving version of this text. The closest thing that we do have is this report, a pamphlet that reproduces the Declaration and the minutes of the convention, printed in Rochester at the offices of the North Star, Frederick Douglass's newspaper. Only one of the 100 signers, Charlotte Woodward Peirce, who was a teenager in 1848, lived long enough to see the summer of 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Here she is in 1920 at age 90 after spending her entire life campaigning on behalf of suffrage and allied causes from her home in Philadelphia. So, before I get too far away from it, here's a question. Other than falling on the same calendar date, do the two anniversaries tonight, the Seneca Falls Convention and the moon landing, have anything else in common? Well, yes, they do. And that thing they have in common is DNA. Gary Watrous, a descendant of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was an engineer and part of the mission control team in Houston for Apollo 11. That said, the fact of the matter is that there is much we do not know about the lives of the signers of the Declaration of Sentiments, and new revelations about who they were are being made all the time. As recently as 2011, it was rediscovered that signer Eunice Newton Foote conducted an experiment in Seneca Falls in the 1850s that captured the role carbon dioxide plays in temperature changes in the atmosphere. Here is the study she published with her findings. So she discovered the root cause behind global warming. At least one signer, Betsy Tewksbury, lived out her life right here in Elmira after she sent two sons off to the Civil War, one to be wounded at Gettysburg, the other to be captured and taken as a prisoner of war and held at Andersonville Prison. So, I've talked so far about Mark Twain's neighbors in the Finger Lakes region. Now let's talk about the author himself. By the latter half of his life, Twain would reserve high praise for the movement that began at Seneca Falls and for what suffragists had managed to accomplish during his lifetime. He makes this much clear in Following the Equator, a travelogue first published in 1897, which is Twain's account of sailing across the South Pacific on the first leg of a circumnavigation of the globe. His journey took him to New Zealand in 1894, a country where women had won the right to vote just the year prior. The New Zealand election of 1893 was a bold democratic experiment. Not only did all adults have voting rights regardless of sex, but New Zealand was also now a functioning pluralist democracy, in that both the indigenous people, the Maori, and those descended from European settlers were able to vote and have representatives in government. And here is a contemporary illustration of women heading to the polls in 1893. 85.18, not 85, but 85.18 of registered Kiwi women voters, by Twain's calculation, had turned out for the 1893 election, a number he is rightly impressed by. Do men ever turn out better than that in America or elsewhere, he asks? This gives Twain pause to reflect on the American suffrage movement, where activists still struggled and still worked and still waited to win franchise. The clear example of progress in New Zealand is set in sharp contrast with the situation in the United States, where the suffrage movement had entered a period of unproductive stasis with minimal legislative victories, a time since called the doldrums. Though the suffragists' ultimate goal had not yet been realized, this is not something Twain sees in any way as a failure. Rather, he urges the reader in no uncertain terms to understand all that had been changed since July 20th, 1848. In that interval, American suffragists had managed to create a great deal of transformation within their own culture. Twain writes, quote, "Men ought to begin to feel a sort of respect for their mothers and wives and sisters by this time. The women deserve a change of attitude like that, for they have wrought well. In 47 years, they have swept an imposingly large number of unfair laws from the statute books of America. In that brief time, these serfs have set themselves free, essentially." End quote. His strong rhetoric to this effect did not go unnoticed. Anna Howard Shaw and Alice Stone Blackwell, two prominent suffrage leaders, would give congressional testimony after the turn of the century, recognizing Twain as one of a number of literary celebrities who supported the cause, so there was something of a reciprocal appreciation there. But this had not always been the case. Twain had not always been so stalwart and unflagging in his support. He began his literary career instead as something of an anti. In a series of condescending comical letters to the editor published in the Missouri Democrat in 1867 and reproduced elsewhere nationally, he scoffs at the extension of political rights to women. Here is an excerpt of that piece republished in the Lincoln County, Missouri Herald in July 1862, stating, "Such a tyranny as this we could never stand. Our souls could never endure such degrading thraldom. Women, go away. Seek not to beguile us of our imperial privileges. Content yourself with your little feminine troubles and let your natural bosses do the voting." However, by the year 1874, Twain had undergone a dramatic conversion, and he would admit as much later in life. In a more sober letter published in the London Standard, he has changed position and recognizes that he cannot, quote, "bring myself to find fault with the women whom we call the Crusaders, since I feel that they, being politically fettered, have the natural right of the oppressed to rebel, end quote. A sea change had clearly occurred within him in that time. So, one might well ask, how did Twain's conversion in the 1870s play out in the fiction that he produced during that period, especially with Seneca Falls right up the road from Quarry Farm? He had more than enough local material to use as inspiration for some yarn about the political and cultural merits of women's suffrage set right here in the Finger Lakes, right? Yet, he decides to look slightly farther abroad to tell this story. He turns instead here, to the microscopic island nation of Pitcairn. Now, I'll stop for a second so we can get our bearings as to where in the world we are exactly. First off, yes, this is planet Earth, about 5,700 miles away from us as the crow flies, but why a crow would want to subject himself to that journey, I have no idea. You might not have known before right now that you can look at the Earth from a certain perspective in space and see almost only water, but that is the case. So this is the Pacific Ocean, of course, and you can barely make out New Zealand in the very lower left-hand corner of the globe. On the far right, you can barely make out the west coast of South America. Here is another view of the same place relative to Tahiti and Bora Bora, and with South America there marked on the right. You can't see it in this view of the globe, but Hawaii is going to be to the north and west of Pitcairn Island. Okay? So Pitcairn is tiny, about 2 miles wide and 1 mile long, a long little rock in the mid-Pacific, as Twain calls it. And it is remote. It is described in a 1933 film as a rock at the bottom of the world, which is understandable. Pitcairn now does have a website of its own, though, where you can find out information about relocating there, if you're so inclined. So, this little island is often celebrated as the first sovereignty on Earth to permanently grant female citizens the right to vote, doing so in November 1838, 10 years in advance of the Seneca Falls Convention and 55 years before New Zealand got around to it. The founding fathers of Pitcairn were the mutineers of the HMS Bounty, and by 1838 they had no objections to the groundbreaking political innovation taking place on their island. This is because they had all been murdered. Indeed, the sequence of events that led up to the enfranchisement of women on Pitcairn is as tragic as it is singular and unbelievable. It brings to mind arguably the most quoted adage that Twain ever created, which appears again in Following the Equator. Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. The majority of chapter headers in Following the Equator pull epigraphs from a non-existent book, Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar, which is the Ben Franklin-inspired Poor Richard's Almanac-style encyclopedia that Pudd'nhead Wilson is in the process of compiling in his novel of the same name, in which, of course, he is a very minor character. The chapter that ensues in Following the Equator deals with imposters and charlatans posing as Mark Twain in Australia, and it is interesting to think about the relationship between this epigraph and the content of the chapter. The history of Pitcairn Island confirms Twain's truism here. If its story was put forth as fiction, it would be flatly unbelievable. Pitcairn, as a result, provides a perfect literary sandbox or non-fictional universe for Twain to play around in and make his own. The story of Pitcairn begins aboard the HMS Bounty, and if you've seen any of the film adaptations of Mutiny on the Bounty, you have a head start here. But just so we're all on the same page, in 1787, the Bounty, helmed by Captain William Bligh, was dispatched from England to Tahiti with the mission of securing specimens of the breadfruit tree, a staple crop in the Pacific that was unknown in the Atlantic world. The Bounty was going to transport samples of the species from Polynesia to be planted in the domains of the British Empire in the Caribbean to support local populations there. Once in Tahiti, Once the bounty had arrived, Captain Bligh, very carefully and very diplomatically, according to his own account, secured breadfruit saplings with the cooperation of the Tahitians. And here is kind of a painting of that transaction that might get a few things wrong. But at some point after departing Tahiti with a full cargo of breadfruit, the crew of the Bounty launched a mutiny against Bligh. Here is a contemporary illustration of the incident where Bligh and his loyalists are being set adrift in a dinghy to fend for themselves on the open ocean. And you can see the mutineers and the breadfruit trees still on board. Everyone is saying their goodbyes. The reason behind the mutiny has been the subject of much academic and popular speculation. In film adaptations, Bligh is an awful despot who subjects his crew to frequent beatings and extreme privation. In actuality, Bligh's crewmen were forced to endure much less corporal punishment on the Bounty than they would have on other prominent British sea captain ships during the same period. But first-hand accounts paint a picture of Bligh as being unhinged, verbally abusive, and a severe and petty micromanager and paranoid control freak in his dealings with subordinates. The Bounty affair would be one of no less than 3 mutinies Bligh faced in his lifetime, which should tell us something. Led by former first mate Fletcher Christian, the rebellious Bountyites were now fugitives who faced court-martial and execution for their offenses if captured. On the lam at sea, they sailed meanderingly around Polynesia before the mutineers finally took permanent refuge on Pitcairn, which had not been inhabited by humans since the first millennium, so peripheral is it to the Polynesian world. Pitcairn's exact location had allegedly been misplaced on sea maps and was therefore outside the cartographic knowledge of the British Empire and its austere legal retributions. But when left to their own devices after settling on Pitcairn, the Bounty mutineers failed to build a brave new world there. While the revolt aboard the Bounty was bloodless, the early years of life on Pitcairn devolved into infighting and near total violence. A civil war erupted between 9 British Bountyites and the 6 Polynesian males who had accompanied them to Pitcairn. It is thought that freshly drawn lines of racial division fomented the conflict. Fletcher Christian implemented a plan to allot property on the island to the British mutineers while leaving the Polynesian males landless and thereby doomed to positions of servitude as second-class citizens. The result of the strife was devastating, taking the lives of 12 of the community's 15 males, a staggering fatality rate of 80% within the first 10 years of settlement. And here is NCY's imagining of the murder of Fletcher Christian. Deaths by accident and disease ended the lives of 2 of the 3 remaining male survivors, leaving a single Bountyite, John Adams, to coexist with the 12 Tahitian women who journeyed to Pitcairn, along with the mutineers' posthumous children born on the island. Retelling the story of the Bounty became something of an obsession in popular culture of the 20th century. The 1932 novelization by Nordhoff and Hall, which was eventually published with beautiful illustrations by Wyeth, then inspired movies in 1933, 1935, 1962, and 1984, starring Errol Flynn, Clark Gable, Marlon Brando, and Mel Gibson, respectively, who all play Fletcher Christian. I do have to recommend the 1984 film The Bounty, where none other than Anthony Hopkins plays Captain Bligh. It is clearly the role that helped him land the part of Hannibal Lecter later on. Remarkably, all the movie adaptations of Mutiny on the Bounty leave out the Civil War that was the grisly epilogue to the Bounty saga. In the Wake of the Bounty from 1933 with Errol Flynn does gloss over it in a short scene, but by and large, the end of the film, the happily ever after, comes instead as the mutineers arrive at or are en route to Pitcairn, at the comparatively optimistic moment of the nation's birth. Lord Byron makes the same creative decision in his 1823 poem in heroic couplets, The Island, or Christian and His Comrades, leaving the Bounty mutineers at sea, alive and well, pre-Pitcairn. This general practice of narrative omission reveals much about what has made the Bounty story so attractive and worthy of retelling in print and film. The mutiny took place at roughly the same time as the American Revolution. It was an analogous, somewhat microcosmic rejection of tyranny and absolute despotism in an age of Atlantic revolutions located just one ocean over. But in the end, Pitcairn resembled its Atlantic counterparts perhaps all too well, as it too was given over to similar eruptions of factional violence that hobbled its post-revolutionary period. One rare exception to this rule of exclusion is Mark Twain's The Great Revolution in Pitcairn, first published in the Atlantic in March 1879. It asks if the women of Pitcairn are entitled to reject tyranny in the same way that their male ancestors did. And the story offers up the larger question of what right women generally have to resist the terms of their oppression. 1879 was an interesting year to be telling this story. In 1869 and 1870, the territories of Wyoming and Utah, they were not yet states, had passed legislation giving female residents the right to vote. These developments at home sparked renewed interest in Pitcairn, where women had been voting by that time for more than 3 decades. Twain presents the gory first act of Pitcairn's history as having transformed it, paradoxically, into a utopian Garden of Eden. The island has experienced the book of Genesis in reverse, you might say, where the fratricide of Cain and Abel has given way to an aggression and testosterone-free peaceable kingdom, where there is no violence, no money, no exploitation, and no more war. Pitcairn is so far removed from the common track of commerce that it remains sheltered safely away from modernity and exists in a, quote, deep Sabbath tranquility, neither knowing nor caring what was going on in the mighty empires that lie beyond its limitless ocean solitudes. Once in 3 or 4 years, a ship touched there, moved them with aged news of bloody battles, devastating epidemics, fallen thrones, and ruined dynasties, then traded them some soap and flannel for some yams and breadfruit and sailed away, leaving them to retire into their peaceable dreams and pious dissipations once more. The sole occupation of the people were farming and fishing, their sole recreation, religious services, end quote. Indeed, the crisis of civil war had been a traumatic event, prompting John Adams, the last surviving mutineer, to undergo a conversion that turned his people toward a Christian revival of sorts, seeking forgiveness and salvation for the island's sins from God. Adams led his Pitcairner flock in 5 separate religious services every Sunday. Indeed, after the formerly lost Pitcairners were rediscovered by an American whaler captained by Mayhew Folger in 1808, they were regularly characterized in contemporary sources as the most pious Christians on the entire planet. Only in this paradise, in its Edenic state of nature, can an exotic and preposterous local eccentricity like universal adult franchise flourish. Here, Twain writes, everybody over 17 years old had a vote, no matter about the sex. The Great Revolution in Pitcairn regards women's suffrage ambivalently at first, entertaining doubts about its large-scale reproducibility in the modern world, especially in a more populous nation like the United States. It casts such aspersions immediately before embarking upon a scenario in which suffrage arises as a political necessity and an imperative of national survival. Their isolation from the world by virtue of geography and being descended from fugitives seeking to avoid detection makes the Pitcairners somewhat naive and therefore vulnerable. No one on the island is world-weary enough to worry about how tyranny and empire might be delivered to their shores. In the Great Revolution of Pitcairn, the task of ruining everything and importing dystopia falls to an American vagabond and grifter named Butterworth Stavely. So, the short story was never illustrated, even though it begs for illustrations, and I just wanted to find an image to stand in for Butterworth, so here. Stavely is a character quite unlike Twain's other confidence men, who are perfectly intent on just getting rich off of the hustle that they're running. Stavely has much grander ambitions. The man who would be king, once ashore, he hatches a plot to become Pitcairn's absolute monarch. And you might wonder, where in the hell did Mark Twain concoct such a ludicrous premise for his short story? Well, it too actually happened. From his arrival in 1832 until being forcibly removed in 1837, one Joshua W. Hill fashioned himself as the moral arbiter and de facto ruler of Pitcairn and its then 90 or so inhabitants. The American-born Hill portrayed himself as an English aristocrat, an agent of the British Empire who could summon battleships at will if disobeyed. In many respects, an avatar and second coming of Captain Bligh, Hill's self-ordained and ham-fisted mission was the religious and moral reform of the Pitcairners, who again were thought to be the most religious people on the planet. He delivered sermons in the island's chapel within arm's reach of a musket. Hill built a prison and demonized the island's resident aliens, Britons who had made their way ashore and married among the locals. He found pretext to beat at least 2 naturalized emigres who challenged his authority, flogging one nearly to death. Among Hill's strange obsessions, he seems to have been preoccupied with maintaining the racial purity of the Pitcairners, who by this time were all of blended British and Polynesian descent. Tilman Nechtman's 2018 book, The Pretender of Pitcairn Island, tries to make sense of Hill, this mysterious character with a very convoluted and questionable backstory. Was Hill a con artist, a missionary, an aspiring cult leader, a wannabe dictator, or some mixture of all these things? I don't know the answer to that, but it's obvious why Twain gravitated to Hill as a subject. Butterworth Stavely, Twain's proxy for Hill, is decidedly more demagogic than his historical inspiration. He subverts Pitcairn's serenity by guile rather than by threat and force, parlaying his election as island magistrate into ultimately being coronated emperor. His plan of attack very much involves turning citizens against each other and fostering division, sowing the seeds of discontent among the people, as Twain writes. Prior to Stavely's arrival, Pitcairn was a society without social distinction, and after years of intermarriage, its small population represented a single extended family. To destabilize the community and disrupt its social structure, Stavely instigates a prolonged and bitter legal dispute over the case of a chicken who trespassed onto someone else's farm. The matter takes several years to litigate as it winds its way through Pitcairn's system of higher courts. Stavely stokes dissatisfaction among the Pitcairners by calling for the impeachment of a number of the island's leaders, but he doesn't stop there. John Adams had unofficially and somewhat apologetically counted Pitcairn as an appanage of the British Empire. In fact, it would become an overseas territory of the United Kingdom in 1838 and remains so to this day. Stavely, perhaps resurrecting some of the resentment that inspired the Bounty Mutiny, cries for independence from the British and condemns the galling English yoke that the island clearly suffered under. This generates some confusion among the islanders who point out, quote, "We had not noticed that it galled. How does it gall? England sends a ship once in 3 or 4 years to give us soap and clothing." To this, Stavely replies, with not a little bit of melodrama and mock revolutionary fervor, "This speech shows how fallen you are, how base, how brutalized you have become under this grinding tyranny. What? Has manly pride forsaken you? Is liberty nothing? Are you content to be a mere appendage to a foreign and hateful sovereignty when you might rise up and take your rightful place in the august family of nations, great, free, enlightened, independent, the minion of no sceptred master, but the arbiter of your own destiny, and a voice and a power in decreeing the destinies of your sister sovereignties of the world?" End quote. Their anti-colonial fervor whipped into a frenzy, the citizens eventually fall to denouncing the British Empire and trampling upon the Union Jack. Stavely, riding the high tide of factionalism, leads a coup d'etat against the British in absentia, institutes his own empire in place of it, and begins reigning as Emperor Butterworth I. Stavely deals a final blow to this formerly classless culture by creating caste and instituting a nobility. He bestows titles upon a cadre of loyalists who are now known as the Grand Duke of Galilee, Archbishop of Bethlehem, Marquis of Ararat, Countess of Jericho, and Viscount Canaan. These fabricated honorifics refer to places in the Holy Land and sound much like the titles given to the transplanted European nobility that ruled during the Crusades, something Twain explores in The Innocents Abroad. Shortly after ascending to the throne that he invented, Emperor Butterworth takes his newly minted empire swiftly and directly to the brink of ecological and economic collapse. Stavely, it turns out, is consumed with the labor of propping up his bureaucracy, and he compulsively continues to add on to his administrative state. In due course, every citizen has been given a title, inducted into the court aristocracy, or drafted into the island's military, including all children above the age of 10. With no one left to cultivate crops and maintain homesteads, the populace suddenly faces starvation. The demands of maintaining an empire amidst an imminent and existential humanitarian crisis gives the somewhat bewildered Pitcairners reason to ask, do we need an empire and an emperor? The people eventually become fed up with Stavely's antics and launch their own coup. Quote, "The convulsion came, the nation rose as one man, though 49 of the revolutionists were of the other sex. The infantry threw down their pitchforks, the artillery cast aside their coconuts, the navy revolted, the emperor was seized and bound hand and foot in his palace." Through this course of events, the Great Revolution in Pitcairn seems to concede that the exercise of self-determination, regardless of sex, is required to depose a toxic, apocalypse-inducing autocrat like Stavely. Women's political engagement evolves in the short story from a local, unconventional island foible into a necessity required for national survival in a moment of extreme emergency. And the revolt against Stavely is undertaken, it should be noted, with pantomimed and not actual violence. An assassination attempt that occurs as the emperor parades in his gilded imperial wheelbarrow fails to land any blows. Instead, Stavely's assailant stabbed at him 15 or 16 times with the harpoon without managing to break the skin. So the lessons of the past have informed the peaceful overthrow of the narrative's tin pot dictator. This reluctance to engage in violence is perhaps informed by an aversion to bloodshed born out of the hard lessons and traumas of the 1790s. This nonviolent civil disobedience parallels Twain's praise for the American suffrage movement in Following the Equator. In the half-century since 1848, Twain feels that the Great Revolution, which had already taken place in the United States, was unique and was exceptional. Quote, "Men could not have done so much for themselves in that time without bloodshed. At least they never have, and that is an argument that they didn't know how. The women have accomplished a peaceful revolution and a very beneficent one. In that same time, Twain finds that the planet had been transformed from a, quote, dull world, ignorant and stupid, to one that is growing less and less dull all the time." In much of his opus, Twain maintains an abiding disdain for ideology and literature's connected to ideology, and how they may be deployed to romanticize and otherwise camouflage regimes of violence. The actions of Pitcairn's rebels and American suffragists present, it seems, one alternative of meaningful political action without violence, which represented a novelty in his time, as patently obvious as it may seem from our vantage point in history. The year after Joshua Hill's deposition and removal from the island in 1837, with a little help from the British Admiralty, the people of Pitcairn adopted a constitution that mandated universal childhood education and guaranteed franchise for all adults, a global first. Histories of Pitcairn up to the present moment are hesitant to recognize the causal connection between Hill's mini-invasion and the codification of suffrage into law, which took place less than a year apart from each other. Suffrage evidently came into existence in this case as an anti-colonial strategy designed to protect the island from future political usurpations. It was also remedy and reaction to the power vacuum and generational crater brought about by the die-off of the Civil War of the 1790s. Universal adult franchise could maximize self-representation among the island's small population and prevent one-man foreign incursions like Stavely's and Hill's. For its strategic fence-sitting, I think of the Great Revolution in Pitcairn as a conversion narrative. Here and elsewhere in his body of work, Twain coyly entertains both sides of an issue in the opening of a narrative or essay, before laying bare the fallacies that plague one position. Huckleberry Finn's conversion is an excellent example of this. He is won over to the cause of abolition through his interactions with Jim and his own personal epiphanies, after being raised in the repressive institutions and an ideology that endlessly attempted to justify the horrors of chattel slavery. The enfranchisement of women on Pitcairn was a microcosmic innovation that empowered only a few dozen individuals, but it spoke to broader changes about to transpire around the world. The Great Revolution in Pitcairn initially airs its doubts that women's suffrage can be successful on a scale past that of a micronation, before undergoing a conversion in the course of the story, and possibly trying to convert the reader to the conclusion that it must be a useful ingredient in the future continuity, equity, and prosperity of all nations. Thank you.